My cousin, Natasha, was the family's golden girl. She had the Ivy League degree my parents couldn't afford for me, the perfect smile that could disarm anyone in seconds, and a terrifying ability to take credit for things she didn't do. When she used her connections to steal the senior creative director position I had spent 8 years working toward, she told me that some people are born to lead, and others are born to support. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I just packed my desk and left her with the biggest project in the company's history. She got the title. She got the corner office with the city view. What she didn't realize was that she'd just walked into a room with no oxygen, and I was the only one holding the key to the door. My name is Veronica Hayes, and this is the story of how silence became my most powerful weapon. I am what the industry calls a ghost architect for high-end luxury branding. For 8 years, I stayed in the background, building the visual identities for billionaire startups, tech companies going public, and fashion houses launching their digital empires. My name stayed off the masthead, buried in fine print that nobody ever read. I didn't care about the fame or the magazine covers or the award ceremonies. I cared about the craft, about building something so perfect that it looked effortless. I drove a well-maintained Lexus ES that was 7 years old, paid for in cash, reliable and understated. That car was a perfect representation of who I was: solid, dependable, underestimated by everyone who saw it parked next to the flashier vehicles in the company lot. Natasha, however, lived her entire life on a stage. She was 3 years older than me, and from the moment we were kids, she'd been the star of every family gathering. She went to Yale on our grandmother's inheritance, the money that was supposed to be split between all the grandchildren, but somehow ended up going entirely to her education. She majored in marketing, minored in theater, and came out with a degree that looked impressive on paper and a network of connections that she wielded like weapons. After graduation, she spent 5 years bouncing between startups that failed, always managing to exit right before everything collapsed, always finding someone else to blame for the disasters she left behind. She spent what remained of her inheritance maintaining a lifestyle she couldn't actually afford. A downtown loft with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that ate up most of her paycheck. Designer clothes purchased on credit cards that she juggled like a circus performer. Dinners at restaurants where a single meal cost more than most average earners' week's paycheck. Vacations to Bali and Barcelona that she documented obsessively on social media, creating this perfect illusion of success. She was waiting for her big break, the opportunity she felt the world owed her simply because she'd gone to the right school and knew the right people. She never understood that success wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built, brick by brick. I worked at Aura Global, the luxury branding agency that every creative professional in the city dreamed of joining. I'd started there as a junior designer 8 years ago, fresh out of state school with a degree nobody was impressed by, and a portfolio that got me in the door through sheer quality of work. I spent those 8 years learning everything I could, taking on the projects nobody else wanted, staying late every night perfecting details that most people would never notice. I built systems, created frameworks, developed proprietary tools that made our workflows faster and our final products better. I was the foundation of every major campaign we launched, even if my name was never on the presentation slides. 6 months ago, the position of Senior Creative Director opened up. The previous director, a woman named Catherine who'd actually respected my work, was leaving to start her own agency. Everyone in the office knew the position was mine. I had designed Aura Global's entire winter campaign from my kitchen table, a massive project involving 12 luxury brands and a budget of $40 million. The campaign had increased our client retention by 35% and brought in 8 new high-value accounts. The CEO, a man named Frederick Sterling, had personally thanked me for the work. He'd said I was the future of the company. I started preparing for the role, sketching out my vision for where we could take the agency in the next 5 years. Then Natasha found out about the opening. I made the mistake of mentioning it at a family dinner, excited for the first time in years about something happening in my career. I should have known better. Natasha's eyes lit up with that particular gleam I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. Within a week, she'd updated her LinkedIn profile with a title she'd never held and a list of accomplishments that sounded impressive until you realize they were completely vague. She started showing up at the coffee shop across from Aura Global's office building, always there at 8 in the morning when Frederick Sterling arrived, always conveniently running into him, always charming and polished and ready with some observation about branding trends she'd read about online. Natasha spent 3 months executing what I can only describe as a surgical campaign. She wined and dined Frederick Sterling at restaurants I couldn't afford, invited him to gallery openings and networking events where she could introduce him to her Yale connections, sent him articles and books about luxury marketing with handwritten notes. She was building a relationship, making herself indispensable, positioning herself as someone who understood not just the creative work but the business side, the strategic vision, the future of high-end branding in a digital age. And then she showed him her portfolio. Except it wasn't actually her portfolio. It was a carefully curated collection of my discarded drafts, concepts I'd abandoned or pivoted away from, all of which she'd scavenged from our shared family cloud storage. I didn't know about the cloud storage theft until later. Natasha and I had set up a shared folder years ago for family photos and holiday planning documents. I'd forgotten it even existed, never thinking to check what else might be in there. But Natasha had apparently been monitoring it, watching every file I uploaded for my personal backup. She'd found dozens of my early concept drafts, the experimental work I did before finalizing client presentations. She cleaned them up slightly, added her own name to the metadata, and presented them to Frederick as proof of her creative genius. They were good concepts because I'd created them, but they were incomplete, early-stage ideas that I'd ultimately improved upon or discarded entirely. The day of the announcement arrived on a Tuesday in March. Frederick called an all-hands meeting at 10 in the morning. Everyone gathered in the main conference room. I stood near the back, confident and calm. I dressed carefully that morning, wearing my best blazer and the silver necklace my mother had given me for my 30th birthday. I was ready to accept the role, to thank the team, to outline my vision for our future. Frederick stood at the front of the room, smiling his corporate smile, and began talking about the importance of fresh perspectives and bold leadership. And then he said Natasha's name. My blood went cold. I watched her stand up from where she'd been sitting in the front row, watched her walk to the front with perfect confidence, watched her shake Frederick's hand while the room applauded. Frederick never looked at me during the entire announcement. He kept his eyes on Natasha, on the board members who'd flown in for the meeting, on the senior partners who were nodding approvingly. He talked about how Natasha brought exactly the kind of innovative thinking Aura Global needed, how her portfolio demonstrated a boldness and vision that would take us into the future, how her connections and strategic mind made her perfect for leading the creative department through its next phase of growth. I stood there feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet, like I was falling through space with nothing to grab onto. Nobody in that room looked at me. Nobody acknowledged the 8 years I'd spent building this company's reputation. I was invisible. After the meeting ended, I went back to my desk in the open plan workspace where the junior and mid-level designers sat. My hands were shaking as I organized the papers scattered across my desktop, trying to look busy while my mind raced through everything that had just happened. Natasha walked past 20 minutes later, moving toward the corner office that was now hers. She stopped at my desk, leaning down close enough that only I could hear her words. "Don't worry, Veronica," she whispered, her voice sweet as poison. "I'll make sure you keep your junior salary. I'll need someone to do the formatting and technical work while I handle the vision and strategy." She smiled that perfect smile, the one she'd been using to charm people since we were children, and walked away. That Sunday, our extended family gathered for dinner at my aunt's house like we did every month. My aunt, Natasha's mother, was practically vibrating with pride. The moment everyone had arrived and settled around the dining table, she stood up with her wine glass raised high. "I want to make a toast," she announced, her voice carrying through the room. "To my brilliant daughter, Natasha, who just became the youngest senior creative director in Aura Global's history. We always knew you were destined for greatness, sweetheart." Everyone raised their glasses, cheering and congratulating Natasha while she sat there looking humble and grateful, occasionally glancing at me with something that might have been pity but looked more like triumph. My father, who'd never really understood what I did for a living, leaned over during dinner and patted my hand. "You should be grateful to work under someone so successful, Veronica," he said quietly. "Natasha can probably teach you a lot. Maybe some of her talent will rub off on you." The words stung more than I expected them to. My mother, sitting beside him, gave me a sympathetic look but said nothing in my defense. Across the table, Natasha was holding court, telling everyone about her vision for revolutionizing luxury branding, dropping names of clients she'd never actually worked with, describing campaigns she'd supposedly conceptualized single-handedly. She mentioned the winter campaign, the one I'd built from my kitchen table, and talked about how she'd carried the entire project when the team was struggling with direction. I sat through the rest of that dinner in silence, mechanically eating food I couldn't taste, nodding when people spoke to me but not really hearing their words. I watched Natasha accept praise for work she didn't do, watched my family believe every word she said, watched them look at me with pity or disappointment or simply forget I was there at all. When dessert was finally finished and people started clearing plates, I slipped out the back door without saying goodbye to anyone. I drove home in my reliable Lexus, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles white. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking garage, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to fight. I wasn't going to expose her or argue or try to prove anything. I was simply going to leave. That night, I drafted my resignation letter. It was short, professional, completely devoid of emotion. "Dear Frederick, I am writing to inform you of my resignation from Aura Global, effective immediately. I appreciate the opportunities I've had here and wish the company continued success. Sincerely, Veronica Hayes." I read it 3 times, attached it to an email, and sent it at 11:47 p.m. Then I signed the non-disclosure agreement I'd been given when I first joined the company, the one that protected all proprietary information and trade secrets. I signed it carefully, making sure everything was legally airtight, making sure nobody could ever accuse me of violating my contractual obligations. But here's what Aura Global didn't know, what Natasha certainly didn't know, what nobody had ever bothered to check because I was just a junior designer in their eyes. The entire Aura Global infrastructure relied on a proprietary color grading algorithm I had developed 3 years ago. It was called the Luxlight system, and it was, without exaggeration, the secret sauce that made Aura Global's digital presentations better than every competitor in the industry. The algorithm adjusted product images in real time based on global lighting conditions, time zones, and even the specific display settings of different devices. It made luxury products look consistently perfect, whether you were viewing them on a phone in Tokyo at noon or a laptop in London at midnight. It automatically enhanced gold tones, softened harsh shadows, balanced color temperatures, and created that intangible quality that made expensive things look expensive rather than just shiny. I'd built Luxlight in my apartment over the course of 6 months, using my own equipment, my own electricity, my own time outside of work hours. I'd done it because I saw a problem that needed solving, because I wanted Aura Global's presentations to be flawless, because I took pride in my craft. When I brought it to Catherine, the previous creative director, she'd been amazed. She'd immediately implemented it across all our client accounts, and the results had been transformative. Conversion rates increased by 42%. Client satisfaction scores went through the roof. But because I was just a junior designer, because Catherine wanted to protect me from the corporate politics of intellectual property disputes, and because I'd been naive enough to trust my employer, we'd kept the details of Luxlight's ownership deliberately vague in the internal documentation. What nobody at Aura Global had ever bothered to check was that Luxlight didn't belong to them. It belonged to Veronica Hayes Creative Solutions, the private LLC I'd established 5 years ago on the advice of a lawyer friend who'd warned me about protecting my intellectual property. The algorithm ran on my personal servers, accessed through an API that I provided to Aura Global under what the legal documents very carefully described as an employment licensing agreement. As long as I was employed by Aura Global, they had full access to Luxlight and all its capabilities. But the moment my employment ended, that license would automatically expire after a 30-day grace period. I'd built in that safeguard specifically to protect myself, never imagining I'd actually need to use it. The termination date was clearly stated in the licensing agreement that Frederick Sterling had signed 3 years ago without reading it carefully. 3 weeks after my resignation, Aura Global prepared for the launch of Midnight Sun, a $100 million fashion campaign that was being called the biggest luxury event of the decade. 12 of the world's most exclusive fashion houses had partnered for a coordinated global product launch, everything synchronized to go live at midnight Greenwich Mean Time. There would be a live stream event broadcast to 80 countries, pop-up stores opening simultaneously in 20 major cities, digital storefronts launching across every platform. Natasha was everywhere in the lead-up to the launch. Magazine interviews, podcast appearances, social media posts showing her in expensive clothes, preparing for the big day. She'd positioned herself as the creative genius behind the entire campaign, even though the actual concept and execution had been developed by the team I'd spent years training. I watched the build-up from my apartment, tracking the coverage with detached interest. I'd started freelancing for smaller boutique agencies, clients who actually valued my work and paid me appropriately. My income had tripled since leaving Aura Global. I had more time, less stress, and complete creative control over my projects. But I still kept tabs on the Midnight Sun launch because I knew exactly what was going to happen when that clock struck midnight. The 30-day grace period for my Luxlight licensing agreement had expired 2 days earlier. The algorithm was programmed to perform a licensing heartbeat check at the moment of any major system activation. When it detected that my employment status was terminated and the grace period had ended, it would automatically revert to base settings, disabling all the sophisticated color grading features that made the magic happen. Midnight arrived. I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop that stayed open 24 hours, my laptop open to the Midnight Sun livestream. 20 million people were watching around the world as the broadcast began with sweeping shots of the main venue in Paris, where Natasha stood on stage in a designer gown that probably cost more than my car. She looked confident and polished, speaking into her headset microphone about luxury and innovation and the future of fashion. Behind her, massive screens prepared to display the product launches in perfect synchronized timing. The countdown began. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. Midnight. The screens flickered to life, and I watched the expressions change in real time. The horror dawned slowly, spreading across faces like spilled ink. Without Luxlight, the luxury products on those screens didn't look like gold and silk anymore. They looked like cheap, garish plastic. The lighting was harsh and unflattering, the colors clashing instead of complementing each other, the shadows creating odd distortions that made expensive handbags look like knockoffs. The carefully styled product shots that were supposed to evoke elegance and exclusivity instead looked like bargain bin items under fluorescent supermarket lights. The entire high-end aesthetic that Aura Global had spent years perfecting evaporated in an instant, broadcast live to 20 million viewers. I watched Natasha's face on the screen, saw the exact moment she realized something was catastrophically wrong. She started whispering frantically into her headset, her perfect composure cracking, her hand gestures becoming increasingly desperate as she tried to direct the technical team backstage. The technical team, of course, had no idea what was wrong. They could see that the color grading wasn't working, but they didn't understand the Luxlight system well enough to diagnose the problem, let alone fix it. Natasha tried to direct them, but she didn't even know what an algorithm was in any practical sense. She had the title, the corner office, the salary, but she didn't have the map. She didn't know how anything actually worked. I watched the live stream continue to deteriorate, watched the panicked camera cuts, the awkward attempts to salvage the presentation, the social media reactions flooding in with screenshots and mockery. By 1 in the morning, the hashtag #MidnightFail was trending worldwide. By 2, major news outlets were covering it as a historic marketing disaster. Pre-orders were being canceled by the thousands. Brand representatives were issuing statements distancing themselves from the event. My phone rang at 2:14 a.m., Frederick Sterling. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Veronica," he said, and his voice sounded broken in a way I'd never heard before. "The system is failing. We're losing $4 million an hour in canceled pre-orders. Our technical team says it's something with the color grading algorithm. Natasha says it's just a glitch, that it'll resolve itself, but nothing's working. I need you to come back. I need you to fix this. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee before responding. It's not a glitch, Frederick, it's a trial license. The Luxlight algorithm doesn't belong to Aura Global. It belongs to me, and it was licensed to the company only during my employment. That license expired 2 days ago. The silence on the other end stretched for 10 full seconds. Then I heard Natasha's voice in the background, high and panicked, demanding to know what was happening. Natasha told you she was the vision behind your success, I continued calmly. Surely she can fix a simple lighting error. After all, she's the senior creative director. She must know how her own systems work. Frederick started to speak, but I heard the sound of someone crying in the background. It was Natasha, her perfect composure finally shattered completely. I'm sorry, Frederick, but I signed an NDA. I can't discuss proprietary or global information. You'll have to solve this with your current team. I hung up before he could respond. I finished my coffee, closed my laptop, and drove home through the empty streets. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning, news broke that Aura Global's Midnight Sun launch had resulted in a $70 million loss once all the canceled contracts and penalties were calculated. Natasha was fired within 48 hours. But it wasn't just termination. She was blacklisted throughout the industry. You can't claim to be a creative genius and then fail to explain how your own genius works when everything falls apart. Word spread quickly that she'd stolen credit, that she'd had no idea how the systems actually functioned, that the entire company had nearly collapsed under her leadership. Within a week, I received offers from 3 major agencies, all offering senior creative director positions at salaries that doubled what Aura Global had paid me. I accepted a position at Meridian Creative, their biggest competitor. My first act was to sell them an upgraded version of the Luxlight algorithm for 3 times its original development cost. Aura Global tried to sue for access to the technology, but my lawyer demolished them with the original licensing agreement that Frederick had signed without reading. The case was dismissed within a month. My family tried to call me, asking me to help Natasha, to use my connections to get her another chance somewhere. I sent them a link to a job board for junior designers and blocked their numbers. Natasha eventually found work at a retail mall, folding the very clothes she used to pretend she'd designed. I still drive my Lexus. I still live my quiet life in my modest apartment. But now when I walk into a meeting, when I present my work, when I negotiate my contracts, I don't worry about whether people know my name. I just care that I'm the only one who knows how to build the systems, who understands the architecture, who can keep the lights on when everyone else is panicking in the darkness. Because at the end of the day, a title doesn't make you a leader. A corner office doesn't make you talented. An Ivy League degree doesn't make you irreplaceable. Knowing how to actually build the throne, how to create the systems that everything else depends on, how to be the foundation instead of just the facade, that's what matters. Natasha wanted the crown without understanding that I was the one who'd built everything she was standing on. She got exactly what she deserved, nothing but air beneath her feet when the foundation walked away. Thank you for listening to me as I share my story here at Karma HQ. Check out other Karma-related stories by others on Karma HQ.